This is the story of a recurring nightmare I had as a child. I can place my age between about 4 and 8 because that was how old I was when we lived in the house where I had the dream. My room was next door to my parents', both looking out over our back garden, which went back quite a way and ended in a large hedge, behind which was a park. My little brother and I were always keen to get a gate leading onto the park, but we never did. There was a patio below my window, but no conservatory or anything, just a straight brick wall. I shouldn't logically have worried about anything getting up to my window, but children, and dreams, aren't exactly logical. The dream was always the same, and pretty simple. I was in my bed, which sat next to the window, but rather than having my curtains drawn they were wide open. Which is how I could see the wolf, 3 or 4 times my size, snarling and clawing to get through at me. That's it. No chase, nothing elaborate, just some double glazing between me and a truly terrifying beast. Every time I had the dream I'd try something different, bury my head under the covers, shut the curtains, shout at the wolf or brandish one of my toy guns or swords to try and scare it off. But it just kept clawing away, trying to open the window and get me. I didn't have this dream night after night, but it showed up often enough, and always the same, me unable to do anything but hope that the wolf wouldn't get through the window. Now I'm sure most of you will have had recurring dreams, particular nightmares that haunted you, etc. And for a child that age, wolves aren't exactly an unusual bugbear. What makes this dream pretty spooky to look back on now are 2 things. First, the reaction I got when I told my parents about the dream. My mother told me that she had had the exact same dream when she was my ages, also recurring, only with a lion instead of a wolf. Her in her bedroom, the lion at the window, trying to get in and nothing she could do but wait in fear. Now she told me this to try and make me less scared of the dream, but even at that age, I could tell that she was pretty spooked by the similarity. But what really makes me think about the nightmare, and ensures I bring it up whenever I have a conversation with someone about scary childhood dreams, is how it ended. Our house was across the road from a sporting goods shop, but really oddly in England, this shop, along with rugby balls, cricket bats and Wellington boots, sold shotguns, air guns, and crossbows. Which for a boy my age made it cool beyond belief. Whenever my mother decided to take me to the newsagent for sweets as a treat after school, every other week or so, I'd get my kind Reg or Freddo Frog or what have you, and run out to stare in the window next door at all the guns. If there was a classmate or 2 with me, we'd make classic uninformed kids' judgments about which gun was the best. One night, I was having the wolf dream again, but this time I tried something new. Rather than hide or face it down, I did what any child is supposed to do when confronted with a threat. I walked to the next room and told my parents. I dreamt my father walked into my room after I told him, and sized up the beast clawing at the window. Then he pulled on some jeans, a t-shirt and the bomber jacket he wore when we went to the park in cold weather, and walked out the front door across the road. I dreamt I watched him, fearful and expectant, from my brother's window at the front of the house as he returned from the gun shop, a rifle under his arm. And finally, I dreamt he walked into the back garden, aimed up at the wolf and shot it down dead. I guess at that age you assume your dad's always the hero who saves the day, but in my case it was true. Because after my father shot that wolf dead in my dream, it never came back to trouble my sleep. Not once. Hello. I teleported here to tell viewers, please, like and subscribe to my channel. I grew up in a small town in Idaho. Like any other small town, partying was the only thing for younger people like myself to do on the weekends. Most of the time all of my friends and I would meet up and head out to some remote location so that we could drink beer and smoke weed without our parents bothering us. That tradition would change forever after one cold fall night in 2005. We all met up that Friday night at the local gas station to stock up on beer and cigarettes before heading out to the desert. It was one of those creepy sort of nights. The trees had just finished shedding most of their leaves and the bare branches slightly swaying with the wind made me uneasy. Those kinds of things always freaked me out. I remember telling myself to stop being such a pussy. Nothing bad had ever happened to any of us while we were out in that desert, so I knew that there was nothing to worry about, but regardless, I still couldn't shake this uneasy feeling that I had that night. Something just didn't feel right. I have since learned to trust my feelings when it comes to these types of things, but I certainly did not take those gut instincts into account that night. Our normal party spot was about 20 miles west of town. We would take the highway and then turn off on a small dirt road. We would follow that road until we came to a little canyon. Most of the area was relatively flat, so this little canyon made the perfect place to start a fire without anyone being able to see it from the highway. We started a bonfire with pallets as usual and sat around the fire drinking and talking. Several hours had passed and many people were starting to head home. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning. My friend Sarah and I weren't ready to head home for the night, so we decided to take a little drive out to Harrison Lake. The lake was about 10 miles further down the highway. It was a small body of water that wasn't good for anything other than catching the occasional small fish and swimming with the girls in the summertime. It was also a good place to park and talk. As we approached the small country road that led to the lake, I couldn't help but notice that someone else was already there. I saw the dim flickering light of a campfire near the parking area. This was somewhat unusual because this place was normally deserted this time of year. I decided to keep heading down to the lake anyway, thinking that I probably knew the people. When I pulled up to the parking area, the fire was about 20 feet off the road in a small field. I immediately noticed that something wasn't right. There were 6 people standing in a circle around the fire. They were all wearing black robes with hoods covering their heads and obscuring their faces. There was a large pole coming directly up out of the fire pit, sticking about 10 feet up in the air with some sort of animal impaled on the top of it. It looked like a cat, but I wasn't quite sure at the time. When Sarah saw this, she immediately grabbed my arm and said something along the lines of "Holy shit, get us the fuck out of here." I agreed, but I couldn't leave without saying something to these freaks about the animal they were obviously torturing. I rolled down my window and immediately heard some kind of creepy chanting. Like they were all praying in some sort of fucked up, satanic worshipping way. It sounded like a form of Latin, but I wasn't quite sure. I looked directly at all 6 of them and yelled out my window, "We are going to report all of you freaks to the cops for torturing that goddamn cat." That was a mistake that I will regret for the rest of my entire life. One of the robed freaks immediately snapped its head in our direction and made the most god-awful growling noise. It sounded like a combination of a lion's roar and an old lady screaming. I immediately felt the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I slammed the car into drive and took off as fast as I could. At the same time, I saw this person or creature, whatever the hell it was, throw off its robe and go down onto all 4s. It bolted down the road after us. I could see the moonlight shining off of its body in my rear view mirror as I sped down the road toward the highway. It looked like some sort of half-man, half-werewolf. This thing ran faster than anything I had ever seen. In about 10 seconds it was running next to my window as I sped down the road. I was probably going at least 50 miles per hour and this thing had no problem keeping up with me. It looked over at me and screamed, "You're ours now. You will never escape us," in the most awful sounding voice that I have ever heard. It had no face, just two red glowing eyes and blackness. I floored the pedal and was able to finally pull away from this thing. We made it to the highway and I didn't see anything behind us after that. The entire ride home was unbelievably uncomfortable. We were fucking freaked out beyond belief. Sarah asked me if I would stay at her house that night because her parents were out of town and she didn't want to be alone. I agreed 100%. I didn't want to drive home alone anyway after seeing what I saw at the lake. After about 15 minutes of very fast driving I thought that we were probably in the clear by now. No one was following us and we were almost to Sarah's house. I had no clue that the nightmare we were experiencing was just beginning. We still had a long terrifying night ahead of us. I made the ultimate mistake in buying my first house, trusting someone else's judgment before my own. My fiancé's, to be precise, who picked the location, semi-rural, backing onto an Australian bush reserve, and the house itself, old and dilapidated but, in his words with a lot of character, convincing me he knew an investment and a bargain when he saw one. We had our whole future mapped out and I was happy to just nod and agree with him. So I signed the paperwork and paid the deposit on our future marital home, and then a week after it was all finalized, he broke off the engagement. I was down one fiancé and up one property that I hated and was barely inhabitable. I had paid the entire deposit and he had been going to use his savings to start the renovations straight away. After the initial relationship mourning period, I went into a fuck him action mode and moved into the house. I had bought, along with all the tools and equipment my dad would let me borrow, along with a patchwork knowledge of DIY renovation projects from Google. I wanted to get the place up to scratch and sell it for a profit so I could buy a property somewhere I actually wanted to live. My first night I slept badly, old sheets and a mattress on the floor, waking up sweating at every rustle outside. I had never lived anywhere but the city before, and the sound of living creatures, pushing through the undergrowth, snorts, and animal keening, had me on edge. Even if I could rationalize it, I lay tangled in my clammy bedding, frozen in fear, listening, feeling like an intruder waiting to be discovered. The next few days were tough. I felt isolated and inept, both of which were true. I discovered I had bad reception on my mobile when I tried to call my dad for advice on preparing brick for paint, and the biggest successes I had were clearing branches from the garden and installing a new globe on the back veranda light. Another night soon after, I heard scratching sounds just outside my window and on the veranda. I thought it was a possum or something, but it sounded bigger, and the scratching was loud and frantic. I swallowed my fear and walked to the glass sliding doors that lead into the garden, switching on the light I had installed. I saw a dark shadow move near the house. The bushes at the end of the garden leading into the forest suddenly shake as something crashed through them. It was big, whatever it was, and solid like a hog but with longer legs. It was fast too, loping on all fours, out of sight before I even had time to process what I was seeing. The next night I was ready, and when I heard the scratching again, I all but ran to the light switch. But nothing happened. The switch didn't work. I suddenly felt vulnerable and exposed in front of the glass doors, as though any number of lurking creatures I couldn't see outside in the pitch blackness could all see in. I skulked back to bed, lying awake with my basically useless mobile phone still clenched in my hand just in case. All the while that scratching went on around the house. At one point it sounded like fingernails on my window. Two things I discovered that morning: there were legitimate scratches on my windowsill, etched deeply not just through the flecking paintwork but into the wood, and why my outside light didn't work. The globe was gone. Completely removed. Like unscrewed and taken somewhere. I was getting very scared at this point. I drove into town to go to the hardware store and to get reception to call my dad. I must have sounded crazy in the phone call. I was getting hysterical and I hadn't actually spoken to another human properly for over a week. I speculated through tears that it was my ex, messing with my mind. Knowing about the breakup, and the financial pressure of trying to get the house ready for resale, he tried to calm me down, told me I just wasn't used to the forest wildlife and that he would take time off work to come and help me in a couple of weeks. It was enough to convince me I was imagining things, get my supplies and groceries, and head back home. Things escalated after that. The new light globe I bought was taken the night after I installed it. This time it was shattered on the top step outside of my front door, the opposite side of the house, and I cut my bare feet on it the next morning. The plumbing that had been fine up to that point suddenly started spewing forth a foul-smelling black muck with the texture of custard out of every faucet. I kept finding dead animals at the back of the garden near the forest. Lizards or snakes, birds, a rat, a possum, and then one day, half of a dog. The front half only, its hindquarters gone, insects going to work on the poor animal's eyes and tongue. I dug as deeply as I could and buried it, putting the only flowers I had, some dandelions, on the grave. Another time I left some laundry pegged and drying on the washing line overnight and found it scattered across the garden the next morning. There had been a strong wind, true, but I followed the trail of my clothes blown unfeasibly deep into the forest, some items I never recovered at all. I didn't search far amongst the trees for my clothes. I felt watched. I felt like I was being left a trail. To what end I had no idea. Suddenly the house seemed like a sanctuary, and with the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, I ran back, my arm full of what clothes and linen I had recovered, billowing behind me. During the day I would go into a frenzy of activity, scrubbing, sanding, ripping out the kitchen cupboards and varnishing the floorboards. At night I was a wreck and barely slept even though I was exhausted. It felt like the backyard was getting shorter and the forest was encroaching closer, the animal noises growing ever louder and always that scratching, like something was trying to get inside. It was a relief when my dad arrived to stay, for so many reasons. Someone with more DIY know-how than me and someone to tell me I wasn't going insane. There has definitely been some kind of animal activity out here, you are right. Something is trying to burrow under the foundations. I've got a surprise for you, he told me, already looking pleased with himself. He had bought electric fence wiring and steel posts, along with a battery energizer. Having grown up on a farm, Dad had done this before for temporary grazing pastures for cattle, and we spent the day setting it up along the existing fence posts that ran along the edge of the property where it met the forest. Smugly, he assured me that the fence would give whatever animal it was the right idea, and we sat on the back veranda with a couple of beers until dusk, discussing our next projects for the house. That night he set up a sleeping bag on the floor of the living room. The room with the glass doors looking out onto the back veranda, and I went to bed as usual. For the first time in weeks, I fell into a deep sleep. I have awoken abruptly, however, just after 2 a.m. by the most horrific, agonized screaming I have ever heard. I thought it was my dad at first, and ran into the living area just as he was running to my room thinking it was me. The noise went on and we looked out the glass doors and in the dim moonlight, saw a dark shape on 4 legs, wrestling with the electric fence wires like it was trapped in them. The screaming changed, it became less frightened and took on a breathless, angry grunting. Sparks started spurting from the energizer and in the erratic glow, we saw the creature raise itself onto its hind legs. I heard my dad mutter, "What the hell is that?" in no more than a whisper, and the animal instantly froze. It was impossible to tell in the dark, but I swear it was looking straight at us, not moving despite the pulsing electric wire still wrapped around it. I was gripping my dad's arm and we were both still and tense. Whatever it was, at that moment, raised on its hind legs, it looked vaguely human. But the proportions were wrong. Its torso was too broad, its face too long, its legs bent out at strange angles. It raised its head like it was sniffing the air. And then it charged, straight at the house, straight at us. The wires snapped like twigs and you could hear the solid weight of it, thudding on the ground as it barreled through the garden towards us. Dad yelled, "Car!" over and over again, and I don't know when he picked up his ute keys, but I am glad he did. We ran through the front passage, stopping for nothing, leaving the front door swinging on its hinges. As we wrenched open the doors of the ute, there was a sound of shattering glass and we knew it was in the house. The car was sputtering to life and Dad was shoving the gear stick into place before I had even closed the passenger door. We hurtled down the driveway. It was a couple of kilometers until the nearest main road. I have always thought of my dad as the epitome of safe driving, but we were going so fast, only headlights for guidance, that I swore we were going to hit one of the trees. I yelled at him to slow down and all he said to me was, "Rear view." I watched in my side mirror and saw nothing at first. The driveway was full of bends designed to slow cars down. On a straight stretch, I saw what Dad had seen, that same, dark, hulking form bounding behind us at what seemed impossible speeds. At the next corner in the road, it disappeared into the bush. It was cutting the corners to keep up with us. My heart was icy, I could have vomited with fear. I am so grateful my dad was composed enough to focus on getting us out of there. We made it to the main road and in the welcoming glow of the streetlights, there was no sign of pursuit. "You're not living there again," my dad told me, simply, like I was ever going to disagree. We stayed at a motel for a few nights, met up with an old farming friend of Dad's in the area to borrow his rifle, and went mustered our courage to go back in the daylight. The place was torn to shreds inside. There wasn't a curtain or scrap of carpet untorn. Every window and every mirror had been shattered and the wooden floorboards had what looked like claw marks scratched deeply into them. The mattress in my bedroom was intact, but soaked in blood with an unrecognizable rotting animal carcass draped across it, skin shredded, bones gnawed and decay rapidly setting in. My dad paid to have a company bulldoze the house for me. We told them a pack of wild dogs must have gotten in. I sold the land for a loss and moved back in with my parents. I still feel uneasy when I drive past any sort of bushland, especially at night. Sometimes, over the blare of the radio and hum of the engine, I even think I hear that same screaming noise deep within the trees, like it is following me still.